In week one, we talked about finding the right people, how you control the crowd. Last week, we talked about how you can control the conversions, make sure they go from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead. This week, we're going to talk about controlling the conversation. Yes, you can control the conversation in social media, in your marketing, in your email, in your industry by taking this rich podcast interview content and sharing it with the world.
All right. Hi, Tom. Great to have you here today and to talk about something that you and I talk about together often, and that is how podcast guests can control the conversation.
This is like the third part in our series, right? And over the last 9 years, we've seen that it's not just podcast guesting. If you want to get results, if you want to get impact, you have to control the variables. And those variables are control the crowd, right? We talked about that. Are you talking to the right people? Next one is control the conversions. How do you not just have a nice conversation, but how do you move them from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead? And this week, we are talking about how to go beyond the podcast and control the conversations. So I know what it means in my mind here, Tiffany, but as the marketing manager, as the defender of our brand, what does that mean to you when you hear controlling the conversations?
To me, it means those two things you just used to describe me, the marketing and the brand, right? You're controlling the narrative around your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, all of those things. And you're controlling that narrative online in social media, on your website, through your SEO backlinks, all of those things. And then with that comes a brand narrative as well. You're controlling how, from a PR, a public relations standpoint, right? How your brand is perceived by others in your industry and your competitors and in the podcasting scape as a whole.
I think of how Christopher Lochhead talks about it. You either position yourself or you are positioned. So if you are proactive in putting that information out to your clients on social media, on your email, on your website, and in your sales conversations, well, you can control what is being said, the narrative around that. Whereas if you're always very passive, you're going to be responding to whatever a competitor says. And it's not a good position to be in. One of the things that I love about this discussion is often people just say, I just want to be on podcasts. Well, that's an activity. Podcast guesting is an activity. It's almost like if you go outside now and talk to your tree, that's not public speaking. It's not going to drive business results. So instead of just doing more and more interviews, get more from your interviews. And I think often people will forget that if you control the crowd, you control the conversions, you've maximized the potential impact from every interview. But I don't care how big the podcast is, the vast majority of the world was not listening to that episode at that time. So you can repurpose that interview and get so much more out of it. So I know I do the interviews and then you do the magic of repurposing those and really controlling the conversation. So can you dig into a little bit of what you and the team do after a podcast interview?
Absolutely. So once our podcast interviews here, like these, for example, go live, there's this whole series of tasks that I do to maximize that. I I break it down into snippets, video snippets. To share on reel form, like on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, the reels that everybody loves and enjoys and watches, right? Like, we get into those rabbit holes. I break it down into audiograms with eye grabbing graphics, right? Because you want to capture those people as they're scrolling through their social media leads. And then we have a page dedicated to each episode. This would be the same as the welcome pages that many of our clients do. We repurpose it into blogs, into a newsletter, all of these things to really maximize, pull out the key points that will capture people so that they will go and listen to the full episode and get that full conversation.
It's interesting that I talk to people now and they're like, well, I don't listen to podcasts. And then they'll start talking about Joe Rogan. And I'm like, well, and I would say I've never listened to a full episode of Joe Rogan. I don't have the patience for 3 hours, but just like you do for me, you'll take an interview and find that 45-second clip of pure genius and put that up there. And so people are consuming that information and the content there. And that's so powerful. Lucina Jensen, our senior client success manager, is a master at this also, because you think about repurposing and controlling the conversation. Yeah, you can do it on social media, but I love how she helps prospective clients coming in, right? Because if you think about it, somebody schedules the discovery call. They tell you who they are, what they're trying to accomplish, their website. Well, you can pretty much figure out, oh, okay, they're in the real estate space, or they're in professional services, or they're a nonfiction book author. Well, what she does is that she'll say, hey, here's an interview that our founder did talking just about that. And so it's really controlling the conversation, controlling that narrative around that. So a little bit, talk about how often you do these. Is this something that the podcast goes live and it's done right away? Or how do you think about this as an overall strategy?
I see it as it's a long game. It's a marathon. It is not a sprint. It is not a, you had your interview, you promote it on your social media for the next week, and then you're done with it, right? You never talk about that conversation again. It's something that, for us personally, I have currently scheduled social media posts for our podcast for the next 9 months. I have those prepared. I know what we're going to be talking about, because it's a valid conversation now. It's a good conversation now, and it will also, in theory, be next year, right, or the following year. So it's not a one and done. And then you can take all those pieces that you've broken down, the blog. You can then take that blog and condense it down to right now we're talking about control the conversation. So I could repurpose that as a blog as a whole, or I could repurpose it as, 9 ways you can control your brand narrative or something like that, to take that content and look at it from a different angle, a different perspective, to promote and share again. And like you said, all of this is pointing back to not only in your external marketing, and your brand narrative, like we talked about, but like you said with Lucina and sales, it gives a reference point to your clients, right? Or prospects that come in when you're having these sales calls or discovery calls. Hey, we have a resource for that. I know we don't have time here on our 30-minute discovery call to dive into all of the nuance of this, but go listen to our podcast here. We broke down the 20 minutes, the meat of the conversation to really break that down. So those are all things. That could be a long-term use right there, right? Lucina could use a snippet from one of your interviews, Tom, for the next indefinitely, right? Of you explaining something. So I think that's where maybe people get confused too of, you talked about podcasting being an action or long term. I always reference it to podcast guesting is like a noun, right? It represents a moment in time. It's an action that you do right then. Whereas podcast interview marketing is a verb. It is a long-term action over time. It's not just show up and talk for 30, 45 minutes. It's a marketing channel, really.
Yeah. And I love how you mentioned in there too about the long game, right? And, we're big on data in our company, right? One of the Thomisms is always, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And I know that while you've got it scheduled out 9 months from now, you're also looking probably every quarter and saying, oh, this post did the best, right? This one, everybody loved. Let's do more like this. This one didn't get engagement, so that post will probably get killed off. So it's getting better and better and better. And you also mentioned in there the importance of being timely and timeless in your content. And we learned so much from our clients. And I can think of a couple, right? There was one gentleman, big guy on Wall Street, and he wrote a book for families, right? Everything that he learned at Wharton, he tried to apply to being a family CFO. And he was specifically military families. And I remember somebody asked him a question on a podcast, right? So what tips do you have? What good stock tips do you have? And while it's an interesting question between the host and the guest, like he pointed out, by the time the episode goes live, it's going to be dated material, right? So instead of answering that question, he made it timely and timeless, and came back and said that, while somebody gives you a tip, everybody probably knows it by then, right? So you should not be looking at these little tips, but what are the bigger things, the consistency over time? And then he said, this will work today, next year, or whenever you're hearing this podcast. And I'm like, that is a great way to reframe that question to make it timely and timeless. Or another one of our clients that pointed out to us, Morgan Wright. Morgan's a cybersecurity analyst, and you hear him on a lot of the national news shows. And he pointed out, never make a prediction on an interview. And this happened, during the last presidential episode. Everybody wanted him on air to make a prediction. And he's like, it's a no-win, because after that comes out, if you were right, everybody will say, well, yeah, we all knew that, right? And if you were wrong, everybody will go, oh, what an idiot. Everybody knew that. So be careful for making predictions. And sometimes even, I was on a podcast recently, and they asked me about where podcasts were and where I thought they were going. And I thought it was really important just to say, okay, I am saying this in, mid 2024. I didn't want to say, the date, because I don't know, maybe the host is booked out a couple of months, right? And I didn't want to give that away. So I said mid 2024. And so I sort of said where things were and where I saw it going. So if somebody heard that interview 3 years from now, somebody wouldn't go, oh, the guy's an idiot. That changed years ago. Another one with the timely but timeless. I don't care what holiday it is. Don't wish somebody a happy new year, or a Merry Christmas, or whatever it is, a happy Independence Day while you were on an interview. Because, if I wish you a happy 4th of July, somebody else hears it in another country and they're like, well, what's a 4th of July? Or if you wish somebody a Merry Christmas, now Tiffany has to go and like, oh, I got to take that out to make this evergreen, right? Because it's going to sound really, really funny if you hear it and it's the middle of summer.
Yeah. And I mean, that is a real unfortunate thing, right? Because you are sitting here having a genuine conversation with somebody. So it might be natural to say, hope you have a great 4th of July weekend, as you're wrapping up. But it really does, as a listener, it immediately, because they're immediately subconsciously going to look at their calendar and look at the date and be like, oh, this was a year ago, so I think that's a really good point, to keep it timeless. And positioning it in a way that it immediately doesn't feel old or dated once that time period passes, right? And once the election passes, like you said, for your other example, or with Morgan Wright there, they're immediately going to know, well, that was last year. It's going to make it more difficult for that repurposing and longevity of that interview. And I think that's public speaking, I think 101 kind of in general, right? You want to keep things evergreen, as we say. And we've talked about this too before. I'm going to ping something to you, Tom. We talked about interviews being evergreen, and then we kind of went back on that maybe they're not evergreen entirely, right? They're probably not going to last the next 50 years. Um, what what do you think the evergreen life shelf of a interview is?
Somebody pushed back on that. May have been you, right? Is it evergreen? Is somebody really going to be interested in what I said on a podcast interview 25 or 50 years from now? Probably not, but maybe it's more like a can of soup, right? It's probably good for 3 to 5 years. And that's our experience, right? I can still point to interviews that I did, right? There's one with Jamie Masters on Eventual Millionaire. That interview was 5 years ago. We recently got a client that heard me on that interview. So trying to do that through that. Um, and the other thing that I'm going to point out in the content that I think is really important is it used to be that you had to have good audio. That was a requirement. If you don't sound as good as the host, people aren't going to listen to you. And while what might be acceptable today is going to be laughable a couple of years from now. So make sure that you're not just acceptable, but you're at the higher level, right? And what I saw probably a year, 18 months ago, is that podcasts are switching more and more to video, right? Before the pandemic, 1 out of 5 podcasts included video. Our last state of podcast guesting study that you published, Tiffany, I believe it was 90% of the podcasts had video with them. And so with that, I implore people, make sure your video makes you look like an expert, right? And there's so many little things you can do, right? Have a decent camera. Look in the camera. Don't be looking at the monitor somewhere else. Eye level, right? The camera should be at eye level or slightly above, right? Have professional lighting. Um, you know, that that I've seen people before come on podcast interviews and they're looking down at their laptop. And my youngest girls are the most honest people in my life, and they always remind me, Dad, nobody wants to look up your nose or at your chins, right? Keep the brand going. Make sure that it's above there. So I think that's important with repurposing also. There can be times where if the video is not good, you can't repurpose it. Or if you're talking over the other person, sorry, you just ruined a perfectly good clip.
Yeah, that the point about talking over the other person, that's a really good point. It's natural. I have to consciously remind myself because it's natural when you're in a conversation to say, "Uh-huh, yeah," and interject while the other person's talking. And it's like, no, you're going to ruin the soundbite. Don't say uh-huh or agree or anything. So I try to nod to keep it silent. But yeah, those are things to all consider, right? And it also, you want things that will translate both in audio only and also video. Most majority of podcasts are recorded, like you said, with video. I think it's 92%. But also a majority of people, I think, listen audio only, right? This is often a task that people are doing while they're working out, in their commute, they're doing something else. So you want it also to be a conversation that translate to audio only, even if recording is being involved. I know we toyed with that ourselves. We do every year. Our biggest report, most downloaded report, is the state of podcast guesting, and that is a graph heavy discussion, right? We're walking through the graphs as we talk about our findings, and we tried to decide how to incorporate that into the podcast, right? Knowing that most people are going to listen audio only. They're not going to be seeing the visuals that we might be referencing. But it's still valuable to have that because that goes back to that repurposing, because you're going to capture people in your video, in those reels, in those video shorts, in those audiograms, different things where they're going to see it other places online. And again, be intrigued to come back and listen to that other part of the conversation to get the full full context of what you were describing or explaining.
One of the things that just amazes me since Tiffany has come on board here, a couple of years ago, is we're getting more out of the content that we're creating. And one of the things that I've come to the realization of, through our client Steve Acho, that taught me more is not better, better is better, right? He's a high level recruiter, and he's like, do you want the 7 billion resumes from monster.com, or do you want me to introduce you to the 3 people that could change your business? It's like, yeah, good point. And so it's not just doing more interviews, it's doing more with your interviews. And I've come to the realization that's like, you look at people like, Alex Hormozy or Gary Vee or Tony Robbins, Tiffany, they don't create more content than you and I do each day, right? We have all the same conversations. What they're doing is they're capturing it, which is what we're doing on a podcast interview. And then they're repurposing it and they're putting it out there and getting more mileage out of each interview. And I think that's really the magic or the power of podcast interview marketing now, because, if you've got the CEO of the company, whoever the talent is, their time is valuable, right? They don't have time to go on 100 podcast interviews this month, but like you said, you can take that content, repurpose it. You can get a month's worth of content out of each one. So maybe that's my secret weapon to tell people is stop buying more and more interviews and invest in someone to get more out of every interview.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we say often, right? Is more is not better, only better is better. So, and it really goes back to that maximizing and optimizing your time spent. We know as founders, as CEOs, um, speakers, all of these things, their biggest time constraint, their most valuable commodity is their time, right? And when it comes to adding another entire marketing channel to your business, I think a big obstacle for people is I don't have time for that. I can't add on a whole nother department to my business, right? But it goes hand in hand, like you mentioned there with Gary Vee and those other examples of you're optimizing your time in a way because you have now sat down and talked with another field expert for 30, 45 minutes on your expertise and what you do and why clients should choose you and why um, you are the solver of their problems, why you have the experience to help them in their pains. Um, and then now you've talked about it. It's almost like you did a keynote speaking engagement somewhere. You have all of that content now that you can repackage and share in different ways in different mediums, in different capacities, like we talked about, internal and external marketing. So really, it's doubling up your time, right? I mean, you've done it, you did your interview, and now you're going to repurpose it. That's your marketing for the month or the next 6 months. So it's maximizing that time. Um, and again, going back to just controlling the conversation, um, you're doing that again in turn by not just the content that you repurpose, but also by the shows that you're reaching their audience, their established social media audience, their website, their email list. We've seen this several times come up. One thing that we found in talking about um, bigger is not better, only better is better, is there's always this discussion of, I want to be on a big show, right? People come to us, I want to be on Joe Rogan. And we're like, no, you don't. Like, nothing against Joe. He obviously has a great, successful business position there. But if you are a Fortune 500 CEO, that is not probably the audience you need to or want to be talking to. That's not the best time spent value for you. Um, and so we found that it's those smaller niche shows, like you said, that it's better to talk to a room of 100 people who are looking for you than 10,000 of the wrong ones. And we found that helps in SEO too, going back to that brand narrative of, I know a big thing that clients will look at is shows that are through universities, right? We've seen that come through. Because what they get by going on a university conversation, a university podcast, is they now have a .edu backlink online. And that is instant credibility in the online market, right? Has that been your experience as well with conversations you've had with guests?
And even more so now. I was at a conference recently, and they were talking about SEO, and especially post generative AI. And the the understanding was that everybody, from the search engines to people, their first inclination is, oh, that was written by ChatGPT. And that can even be videos, it can be audio, right? Everybody's thinking that's a fake. That was written by ChatGPT until proven otherwise. And people don't have the time to go through and say, well, I'm going to run it through a tester. No, they just think everything is fake. And the search engines are doing this also. What they're looking now is for collaborative content. And I think you can see this just as you go through social media. Which one of your posts get the most views, right? If it's a picture of you or you and another person together, they're going to recognize both people and they're going to promote it to both of them. And especially if like both people have it on their site, it's like, oh, they're both not faking it. And, or if it's a collaborative video like this or collaborative audio, if you listen to this, you'll realize that I'm not talking in complete sentences. ChatGPT would be much smarter than me. Sometimes I interrupt Tiffany, right? Sometimes there's just that awkward, just like it normally would be, just a normal conversation. And so people start to see that, and the search engines start to see that, and they realize, yes, this is authentic human conversation. And that's why it gets ranked so much higher, and it gets believed so much higher. There's also a concept called obvious thinking and non-obvious thinking. And the category pirates talk about this a lot, Christopher Lochhead and Eddie Yoon. Obvious thinking is what ChatGPT is doing, right? If you ask me how to do something or what's my thought on podcast guesting, obvious thinking is what ChatGPT goes through and pulls out the best thoughts from everybody, sort of that common sense, what everybody knows. That's not interesting, right? That's not information. There's no surprise to it, right? It's like a podcast talking about basic addition, right? Oh, today we're going to be talking about, the 2 times tables. That's not interesting. There's nothing surprising there. The non-obvious thinking, that new ideas, these people that say, no, the world's not like that. I see it a different way. That's interesting. It's interesting on podcast. It's interesting in repurposed content. And I would argue it's even important in social media, because I did a talk recently where I said keywords are dead, long live SEO, right? If you think that the podcasts are still ranking based on what keyword you used, that's what they were doing 20 years ago. Now I swear they're looking at every person, they're listening to things, and they're finding what's new and novel. And that's what they're ranking there. So I think, this repurposed content that is new and novel and non-obvious, that's going to get picked up by people and the search engines.
Absolutely. We know that search engine algorithms now favor, like you mentioned, that collaborative content. It's reaffirming to them that, okay, like you said, both of these people showed up, convened at the same time, had a conversation, and it with Chat GPT and all of that, you are kind of guilty until proven innocent. But that goes back to, like we said, I try not to interject or say when you're talking, but actually that adds favorability in the search engine, in that, okay, this is a real conversation, because two robots would know better than to interrupt or interject an agreement during someone else speaking. So, and I think that in itself is the baseline of what podcast guesting is, right? It is two individuals having a conversation um, on shared expertise, right? With the intention of adding value to that industry, to that community, to that conversation. That, I think that's at its core of what it is, and that's why it's valuable and important. And I think it's also timely as well. Going back to timely and timeless, the search engines, the narrative and around AI and all of that is favoring, people want genuine conversation now, right? They want, we're done kind of with that, the fake beautiful perfect online image that everybody wants to portray. We want just honest, genuine conversation, a real conversation. And so it's leaning into that too, of that trend of what consumers are looking for today as well.
Yeah. I think that is a great summary of our entire series that we did here. If you haven't heard the whole series, go back and check it out. We talked about what's the difference between podcast guesting, which, as Tiffany said, is a noun, and podcast interview marketing, which is a verb, right? What's the difference between an action and a results? And we talked about controlling the crowd, how to find the right people, how to make sure you're talking to the right ones. Then controlling the conversions. How do you move people along from just being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead? And then today, how to control that conversation, how to supercharge your results to maximize your impact, not to do more interviews, but to do more with the interviews. So thank you for listening to this series. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to us. And Tiffany, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others.
Absolutely, Tom. I agreed talking with you today. I think this is a topic we enjoy and love. We could talk about it all day. But yeah, I always appreciate your insights and your wisdom. So thank you.
So there you have it. The foundational secrets, the process to control the crowd, control the conversions, and control the conversations. I hope you learned something in this and will take action on it, because the world needs to hear you. What you have to say matters. It doesn't matter to everyone, but to the people that you can serve, it makes a difference in their life.